梁歌制作，多情剑客无情剑，作者古龙。第一章：飞刀与快剑。冷风如刀，以大地为砧板，视众生为鱼肉。万里飞雪，将穹苍作红炉，融万物为白银。雪将住，风未定，一辆马车自北而来。
Production by Liang Gu, author of Sentimental Swordsman's Ruthless Sword, Gu Long. Chapter 1, Flying Knives and Quick Swords. The cold wind is like a knife, using the earth as a chopping board and treating all living beings as fish. Thousands of miles of flying snow turns the sky into a furnace and melts everything into silver. The snow was about to settle, the wind was still uncertain, and a carriage came from the north.
滚动的车轮碾碎了地上的冰雪，却碾不碎天地间的寂寞。李寻欢打了个呵欠，将两条长腿在柔软的貂皮上尽量伸直。车厢里虽然很温暖，很舒服，但这段旅途实在太长，太寂寞。
The rolling wheels crushed the ice and snow on the ground, but they could not crush the loneliness between heaven and earth. Li Xuanhuan yawned and stretched his long legs as straight as possible on the soft mink fur. Although the carriage was warm and comfortable, the journey was too long and lonely.
他不但已觉得疲倦，而且觉得厌恶。他平生最厌恶的就是寂寞，但他却偏偏时常与寂寞为伍。人生本就充满了矛盾，任何人都无可奈何。李寻欢叹了口气，自角落中摸出了个酒瓶。
Not only did he feel tired, but he also felt disgusted. What he hated most in his life was loneliness, but he always lived with loneliness. Life is full of contradictions, and no one can do anything about it. Li Xuanhuan sighed and took out a wine bottle from the corner.
他大口地喝着酒时，也大声地咳嗽起来，不停地咳嗽，使得他苍白的脸上泛起一种病态的嫣红，就仿佛地狱中的火焰正在焚烧着他的肉体与灵魂。酒瓶空了，他就拿起把小刀。
While he was drinking heavily, he also coughed loudly. The constant coughing made his pale face turn a sickly red color, as if the fire in hell was burning his body and soul. When the bottle was empty, he picked up a knife.
开始雕刻一个人像，刀锋薄而锋锐，他的手指修长而有力。这是个女人的人像，在他纯熟的手法下，这人像的轮廓和线条看来是那么柔和而优美，看来就像是活的。他不但给了他。
He began to carve a figure. The blade was thin and sharp, and his fingers were long and strong. This is a portrait of a woman. Under his skillful technique, the contours and lines of this portrait appear to be so soft and graceful, as if it is alive. Not only did he give her
动人的线条，也给了他生命和灵魂。只因他的生命和灵魂已悄悄地自刀锋下溜走，他已不再年轻。他眼角布满了皱纹，每一条皱纹里都蓄满了他生命中的忧患和不幸。
The moving lines also gave her life and soul, because his life and soul had quietly slipped away from under the blade. He is no longer young. The corners of his eyes were covered with wrinkles, and every wrinkle was filled with the sorrow and misfortune of his life.
只有他的眼睛却是年轻的。这是双奇异的眼睛，竟仿佛是碧绿色的，仿佛春风吹动的柳枝，温柔而灵活，又仿佛夏日阳光下的海水，充满了令人愉快的活力。也许就因为这双眼睛
Only his eyes are young. These are a pair of strange eyes that seem to be green, like willow branches blown by the spring breeze, gentle and flexible, and like the sea water under the summer sun, full of pleasant vitality. Maybe it's because of these eyes.
才使他能活到如今。现在人像终于完成了，他痴痴地瞧着这人像，也不知瞧了多少时候，然后他突然推开车门，跳了下去。赶车的大汉立刻吆喝一声，勒住车马。这大汉满面虬然。
That's why he can live till now. Now that the portrait was finally completed, he stared at it dreamily for an unknown amount of time. Then he suddenly opened the car door and jumped out. The big man driving the cart immediately shouted and reined in the cart and horses. This big man has a beard all over his face.
目光就如雉鹰般锐利，但等到他目光移向李寻欢时，立刻就变得柔和起来，而且充满了忠诚的同情，就好像一条恶犬在望着它的主人。李寻欢竟在雪地上挖了个坑。
His eyes were as sharp as an eagle's, but when he moved his eyes to Li Xuanhuan, they immediately softened and were filled with loyal sympathy, just like a vicious dog looking at its owner. Li Xuanhuan actually dug a hole in the snow.
将那刚雕好的人像深深地埋了下去，然后他就痴痴地站在雪堆前。他的手指已被冻僵，脸已被冻得发红，身上也落满了雪花，但他却一点也不觉得冷，这雪堆里埋着的。
He buried the newly carved figure deeply, and then stood dreamingly in front of the snowdrift. His fingers were frozen, his face was red from the cold, and his body was covered with snowflakes. But he didn't feel cold at all, buried in the snow.
就像是一个他最亲近的人，当他将他埋下去时，他自己的生命也就变得毫无意义。若是换了别人，见到他这种举动，一定会觉得很惊奇， 但那赶车的大汉却似已见惯了，只是柔声道
Just like the person closest to him, when he buried her, his own life became meaningless. If it had been anyone else, they would have been surprised to see him behave like this, but the big man driving the car seemed to be used to it, and just said softly.
天已快黑了，前面的路还很远，少爷你快上车吧。李寻欢缓缓转回身，就发现车辙旁居然还有一行足印，自遥远的北方孤独地走到这里来，又孤独地走向前方，脚印很深。
It's almost dark, and there's still a long way to go. Master, get in the car quickly. Li Xuanhuan slowly turned around, and found that there was actually a line of footprints beside the rut. He came here alone from the far north, and then walked forward alone. The footprints were very deep.
显然这人已不知走过多少路了，已走得精疲力竭，但他却还是绝不肯停下来休息。李寻欢长长叹了口气，喃喃道：“这种天气，想不到竟还有人在冰天雪地里奔波受苦。”
It was obvious that this man had walked a long way and was exhausted, but he still refused to stop and rest. Li Xuanhuan let out a long sigh and murmured, "In this kind of weather, I never expected that there would be people running around in the ice and snow and suffering."
我想他一定是很孤独、很可怜的人。那虬髯大汉没有说什么，心里却在暗暗叹息：你难道不也是个很孤独、很可怜的人吗？你为何总是只知道同情别人，却忘了自己？
I think he must be a very lonely and pitiful person. The bearded man didn't say anything, but he sighed secretly in his heart. Aren't you also a very lonely and pitiful person? Why do you always only know how to sympathize with others? But he forgot himself.
车座下有很多块坚实的松木，李寻欢又开始雕刻，他的手法精炼而纯熟，因为他所雕刻的永远是同一个人。这个人不但已占据了他的心，也占据了他的躯壳。雪终于停了。
There were many pieces of solid pine wood under the car seat, and Li Xuanhuan started carving again. His technique was refined and skillful, because what he was carving was always the same person. This person not only occupied his heart, but also his body. The snow finally stopped.
天地间的寒气却更重，寂寞也更浓。幸好这里风中已传来一阵人的脚步声，这声音虽然比马蹄声轻得多，但却是李寻欢正在期待着的声音，所以这声音无论多么轻微。
The coldness between heaven and earth is heavier, and the loneliness is thicker. Fortunately, there is already a sound of human footsteps in the wind here. Although this sound was much softer than the sound of horse hooves, it was the sound that Li Xuanhuan was expecting, so no matter how slight it was.
他也绝不会错过。于是他就掀起那用貂皮做成的帘子，推开窗户。他立刻就见到了走在前面的那孤独的人影。这人走得很慢，但却绝不停顿，虽然听到了车铃马嘶声。
He would never miss it either. So he raised the mink curtain and opened the window. He immediately saw the lonely figure walking in front. The man walked very slowly, but never stopped, even though he heard the sound of chariots and horses neighing.
但却绝不回头。他既没有带伞，也没有戴帽子，融化了的冰雪沿着他的脸流到他脖子里，他身上只穿件很单薄的衣服，但他的背脊仍然挺得笔直，他的人就像是铁打的，冰雪、严寒、疲倦。
But never look back. He didn't bring an umbrella or a hat. The melted ice and snow flowed along his face and into his neck. He only wore very thin clothes. But his back was still straight, and his body was as if it were made of iron, snow, ice, cold, and fatigue.
劳累、饥饿都不能令他屈服，没有任何事能令他屈服。马车赶到前面时，李寻欢才瞧见他的脸，他的眉很浓，眼睛很大，薄薄的嘴唇紧紧抿成了一条线。
Neither fatigue nor hunger could make him succumb. Nothing can make him give in. Li Xuanhuan saw his face only when the carriage arrived in front. His eyebrows are thick, his eyes are big, and his thin lips are pressed into a tight line.
挺直的鼻子使他的脸看来更瘦削。这张脸使人很容易就会联想到花岗石，倔强、坚定、冷漠，对任何事都漠不关心，甚至对他自己。但这却也是李寻欢平生所见到的最英俊的一张脸。
The straight nose makes his face look thinner. This face is easily associated with granite, stubborn, determined, indifferent to everything, even himself. But this was also the most handsome face Li Xuanhuan had ever seen in his life.
虽然还太年轻了些，还不够成熟，但却已有种足够吸引人的魅力。李寻欢目光中似乎有了笑意，他推开车门，道：“上车来，我载你一段路。”他的话一向说得很简单，很有力。
Although he is still a little too young and not mature enough, he already has a charm that is attractive enough. There seemed to be a smile in Li Xuanhuan's eyes. He opened the door and said, "Get in the car and I'll give you a ride." His words were always very simple and powerful.
在这一望无际的冰天雪地中，他这提议实在是任何人都无法拒绝的。谁知这少年连看都没有看他一眼，脚步更没有停下来，像是根本没有听到有人在说话。李寻欢道：“你是聋子。”
In this endless world of ice and snow, his offer was something that no one could refuse. Unexpectedly, the young man didn't even look at him, nor did he stop, as if he didn't hear anyone talking at all. Li Xuanhuan asked, "Are you deaf?"
少年的手忽然握起了腰畔的剑柄，他的手已冻得比鱼的肉还白，但动作却仍然很灵活。李寻欢笑了，道：“原来你不是聋子，那么就上来喝口酒吧，一口酒对任何人都不会有害处的。”
The young man's hand suddenly grasped the hilt of the sword at his waist. His hands were whiter than fish flesh due to the cold, but his movements were still very flexible. Li Xuanhuan smiled and said, "So you're not deaf, so come up and have a drink. A sip of wine won't do anyone any harm."
少年忽然道：“我喝不起。”他居然会说这么样一句话来。李寻欢连眼角的皱纹里都有了笑意，但他并没有笑出来，却柔声道：“我请你喝酒，用不着你花钱买。”少年道。
The young man suddenly said, "I can't afford to drink." He actually said such a sentence. Li Xuanhuan even smiled in the wrinkles at the corners of his eyes, but he did not laugh, but said softly, "I'll buy you a drink, you don't need to spend money to buy it." The young man said,
不是我自己买来的东西，我绝不要；不是我自己买来的酒，我也绝不喝。我的话已经说得够清楚了吗？李寻欢道：“够清楚了。”少年道：“好，你走吧。”李寻欢沉默了很久，忽然一笑，道：“好，我走。”
"I will never want anything I didn't buy myself, and I will never drink wine I didn't buy myself. Have I made my words clear enough?" Li Xuanhuan said, "It's clear enough." The young man said, "Okay, let's go." Li Xuanhuan was silent for a long time, then suddenly smiled and said, "Okay, I'll go."
但等你买得起酒的时候，你肯请我喝一杯吗？少年瞪了他一眼，道：“好，我请你。”李寻欢大笑着，马车已疾驰而去，渐渐又瞧不见那少年的人影了。李寻欢还在笑着道。
"But when you can afford wine, will you buy me a drink?" The young man glared at him and said, "Okay, I'll treat you." Li Xuanhuan laughed, and the carriage sped away. Gradually, the young man's figure was no longer visible. Li Xuanhuan was still smiling and said,
你可曾见过如此奇怪的少年吗？我本来以为他必定已饱经沧桑，谁知他说的话却那么天真，那么老实。赶车的那虬髯大汉淡淡道：“他只不过是个倔强的孩子而已。”李寻欢道。
"Have you ever seen such a strange boy? I originally thought he must have gone through many vicissitudes of life, but what he said turned out to be so innocent and honest." The bearded man who was driving the car said calmly, "He is just a stubborn child." Li Xuanhuan said,
你可瞧见他腰带上插着的那柄剑吗？虬髯大汉目中也有了笑意，道：“那也能算是一柄剑吗？严格说来，那实在不能算是一柄剑，那只是一条3尺多长的铁片，既没有剑锋，也没有剑颚。”
"Can you see the sword in his belt?" The big man with beard also had a smile in his eyes, and said, "Can that be considered a sword? Strictly speaking, it really can't be regarded as a sword. It is just an iron piece more than 3 feet long. It has neither a blade nor a sword."
甚至连剑柄都没有，只用2片软木钉在上面，就算是剑柄了。虬髯大汉含笑接着道：“依我看来，那也只不过是个小孩子的玩具而已。”这次李寻欢非但没有笑，反而叹了口气，喃喃道。
"There isn't even a hilt, just 2 pieces of cork nailed to it, which is the hilt." The big man with the beard smiled and continued, "In my opinion, it's just a child's toy." This time, instead of laughing, Li Xuanhuan sighed and murmured,
依我看来，这玩具却危险得很，还是莫要去玩它的好。小镇上的客栈本就不大，这时住满了被风雪所阻的旅客，就显得分外拥挤，分外热闹。院子里堆着10几辆用草席盖着的空标车。
"In my opinion, this toy is very dangerous, so it's better not to play with it. The inn in the town is not big, but now it is full of tourists who have been blocked by the wind and snow, and it seems to be extremely crowded and lively. There are more than a dozen straw mats piled in the yard. Covered empty escort cart."
草席上也积满了雪，东面的屋檐下斜插着一面酱色镶金边的标旗，被风吹得猎猎作响，使人几乎分辨不出用金线绣在上面的是老虎还是狮子。客栈前面的饭铺里，
The straw mat was also covered with snow, and under the eaves on the east side, a maroon-colored dart flag trimmed with gold was placed diagonally. It was blown by the wind and made a hunting sound, making it almost impossible to tell that the gold embroidered on it was a tiger. Or a lion. In the restaurant in front of the inn,
不时有穿着羊皮袄的大汉进进出出，有的喝了几杯酒就故意敞开衣襟，表示他们不怕冷。李寻欢到这里的时候，客栈里连一张空铺都没有了， 但他一点也不着急。
From time to time, big men wearing sheepskin coats came in and out. Some of them deliberately opened their clothes after drinking a few glasses of wine to show that they were not afraid of the cold. When Li Xuanhuan arrived here, there was not even an empty bunk in the inn, but he was not in a hurry at all.
因为他知道这世上用金钱买不到的东西毕竟不多，所以他就先在饭铺里找了张角落里的桌子，要了壶酒，慢慢地喝着。他酒喝得并不快，但却可以不停地喝几天几夜。他不停地喝酒。
Because he knew that there were not many things in the world that money could not buy, he first found a table in the corner of the restaurant, ordered a bottle of wine, and drank slowly. He didn't drink quickly, but he could drink continuously for days and nights. He kept drinking.
不停地咳嗽，天已渐渐黑了。那虬髯大汉已走了进来，站在他身后，道：“南面的上房已空出来了，也已打扫干净，少爷随时都可以休息。”
I kept coughing and it was getting dark. The bearded man had already walked in, stood behind him, and said, "The upper room on the south side has been vacated and cleaned. The young master can rest at any time."
李寻欢像是早已知道他一定会将这件事办好似的，只点了点头。过了半晌，那虬髯大汉忽然又道：“金石镖局也有人住在这客栈里，像是刚从口外押镖回来。”李寻欢道：“哦，押镖的是谁？”
Li Xuanhuan seemed to have known for a long time that he would definitely handle this matter, so he just nodded. After a while, the bearded man suddenly said again, "There are people from the Golden Lion Escort Bureau who live in this inn. It seems that they have just been escorted from outside." Dart back. Li Xuanhuan said, "Oh. Who is escorting the escort?"
虬髯大汉道：“就是那疾风剑诸葛雷。”李寻欢皱眉，又笑道：“这狂徒居然能活到现在，倒也不容易。”他嘴里虽在和后面的人说话，眼睛却一直盯着前面那掩着棉布帘子的门。
The big man with beard said, "That's the rapid wind sword Zhuge Lei." Li Xuanhuan frowned, then smiled and said, "It's not easy for this madman to survive to this day." Although he was talking to the people behind him, his eyes were always staring at the door in front that was covered with cotton curtains.
仿佛在等着什么人似的。虬髯大汉道：“那孩子的脚程不快，只怕要等到起更时才能赶到这里。”李寻欢笑了笑，道：“我看他也不是走不快，只不过是不肯浪费体力而已。”
As if waiting for someone. The big man with beard said, "The child's footsteps are not very fast. I'm afraid he will have to wait until the watch to get here." Li Xuanhuan smiled and said, "I don't think he can't walk fast, it's just that he doesn't want to waste his energy."
你看见过一匹狼在雪地上走路吗？假如前面没有他的猎物，后面又没有追兵，他一定不肯走快的，因为他觉得光将力气用在走路上，未免太可惜了。虬髯大汉也笑了，道：
Have you ever seen a wolf walking on the snow? If there is no prey in front of it and no pursuers behind it, it will definitely not be willing to walk fast, because it feels that it would be a pity to just use its strength on walking. The big man with beard also smiled and said.
但那孩子却并不是一匹狼。李寻欢不再说什么，因为这时他又咳嗽了起来。然后他就看到三个人从后面的一道门走进了这饭铺，三个人说话的声音都很大，正在谈论着那些。
But the child was not a wolf. Li Xuanhuan said nothing more, because at this time he started coughing again. Then, he saw three people walking into the restaurant from a door at the back. The three people spoke loudly and were talking about those.
刀头是血的江湖勾当，像是生怕别人不知道他们就是金狮镖局的大镖头。李寻欢认得其中那紫红脸的胖子就是疾风剑，但却似不愿被对方认出他，于是他就又低下头雕他的人像。
Li Xuanhuan recognized the fat man with a purple face among them as the quick wind sword, but he seemed unwilling to do so. The other party recognized him, so he lowered his head to carve his portrait.
幸好诸葛雷到了这小镇之后，根本就没有正眼瞧过人，他们很快的要来了酒菜，开始大吃大喝起来。可是酒菜并不能塞住他们的嘴，喝了几杯酒之后，诸葛雷更是豪气如云。
Fortunately, after Zhuge Lei arrived in this small town, he didn't even look at anyone. They quickly ordered food and drinks and started eating and drinking. But the food and wine could not stop their mouths. After drinking a few glasses of wine, Zhuge Lei became even more proud.
大声地笑着，老二，你还记得那天咱们在太行山下遇见太行四虎的事吗？另一人笑道，俺怎么不记得，那天太行四虎竟敢来动大哥堡的那批红货，四个人耀武扬威，还说什么？
Laughing loudly, second brother, do you still remember the day we met the Taihang four tigers at the foot of Taihang Mountain? Another person laughed and said, Why don't I remember that day the four tigers of Taihang dared to touch the batch of red goods that the eldest brother had protected? The four of them showed off their power and said,
只要你诸葛雷在地上爬一圈，咱们兄弟立刻放你过山，否则咱们非但要留下你的红货，还要留下你的脑袋。 第三人也大笑道：“谁知他们的刀还未砍下。”
As long as you zhuge lei crawl around on the ground, our brothers will let you cross the mountain immediately, otherwise we will not only keep your red goods, but also your head. The third person also laughed and said, Who knows their swords haven't been cut off yet.
大哥的剑已刺穿了他们的喉咙。第二人道：“不是按照老二吹牛，若论掌力之雄厚，自然得数咱们的总镖头金师长；但若论剑法之快，当今天下只怕再也没有人比得上咱们大哥了。”
The elder brother's sword has pierced their throats. The second person said, I, Zhao Laoer, are not bragging,